Hey guys, what up? How's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit more about team building and essentially the real-time current options that we all have and that we fundamentally do consider whenever we build a team, how to approach this, and basically how to understand what's really going on when you build a new team, and like what should be going through your head when you put different Illuvials in there, and all the options that you have open to yourself when doing exactly that. Okay guys, so let's just jump right into it in the first option, which is the super cheap, super lean 8 Illuvial team, right? So what is the idea behind this? The idea behind this usually is that you play the same 8 Illuvials every single game, so you only have to put 8 Illuvials into your team. You usually also only have to put 2 weapons into your team and probably 1 suit. So you end up with 11 slots filled with Illuvials, weapons and suits, which leaves you with 17 slots for augments. So you have a lot of variety and a lot of tech and options, and you can play all the augments in the world that you want to be playing. And if we are looking at this example here, we're also essentially using our Illuvials with a lot of very cheap stage 1 and tier 1 Illuvials. Therefore you can start playing those augments very early, and you can just start utilizing the variety in your team that is built in with that. Now, the very strong upside of this is that you get your whole synergies, your whole team online very quickly, as it's pretty cheap to just play out all your Illuvials, and then you can use the augments to buff up your carries very quickly, and you have a very quick double augment carries. And after that, you can use a bunch of augments to upgrade your small little tank Illuvials into stronger tank Illuvials. On the other side, you also had the option to maybe upgrade your tank Illuvials first, or to upgrade your Lolura, or whatever other utility you could and would want to go for. Now that is one option with the tremendous upside of the most variety in augments that you can go for. Now the big downside, you're locked into the same 8 Illuvials and probably the same order of which you play all of them, which makes you very predictable, and your opponent can probably exploit that to a great extent if they have the options to in their team. Now, the slightly advanced option on this, that would mean, well, you have to play a couple less augments, right? But you can, for example, swap out your low quality Illuvials for higher quality Illuvials. So in this example, we can see there is a lesser water Grocco, so we could easily swap that out for a Stoic Hydrolinx or a Exalted Water Grocco, for example. You could even think, well, we can put the Exalted Grocco and the Hydrolinx, and we can lose the Cara Blue and the smaller Grocco for higher quality Illuvials in the later stages of the game, as we've also seen the last patch notes making, for example, the links a lot stronger and making the difference in strength between a lesser water Grocco and the exalted water Grocco very meaningful. Now, this is essentially the option where we would, for example, just upgrade the quality, but the idea of the team still stays exactly the same. So it's still this very one-dimensional, very easy to play flowchart, 8 same Illuvials thing, and at some point you just kick some of the smaller ones to play some bigger ones. Now, what are other options that we have that are a bit more on the side of giving yourself more options to play with, more options to counter your opponent? You could, for example, be thinking, well, I can just go down, I can even lose all my 3 water Bulwark Illuvials. Let's take out the 2 bigger ones here and use, for example, a Riptorus as an example. You can put in a Toxic tech, utilizing very easy to put in composites while still maintaining the bulwarks, right? So now we would say, okay, at some point in the late game, or maybe even in the early game, if our opponent's opening is very weak into this, we can now decide to just not go for the we can just decide to not go for this exact same setup of those 5 bulwarks, and we can just play 1 less bulwark and exchange another Bulwark for Cara Blue, and we can play 3 Bulwark with Cara Blue and Riptorus to add Toxic to our team. So looking at this option here, you now have a lot of different versions on how you can play the early game, right? You can, for example, play for the Toxic opening, you can play for a Bulwark opening into Toxic, you can play for Scoriox Magma, you can play for Phosphorus Bloom. You just have way more options in terms of how you can approach the early game, how you add more damage with a Toxic Riptorus that by itself deals more damage than additional Bulwark units. You can figure out when to maybe just add more tank stats. Maybe you don't even play for the Lolura, you just play 5 Bulwark plus the Toxic edition now compared to the Bloom edition, and what is like the opportunity cost that we have lost for this? 2 Illuvials. That's 2 augments that you now play less. You will likely be able to find 2 augments that you rarely play or that rarely do a super useful job. So adding in these 2 additional Illuvials that now add a lot of flexibility and a lot of more counterplay to a lot of things that your opponents might be doing. For example, they play a very Colossus healing oriented team. The pure damage of Toxic, very powerful into that, especially in the earlier rounds, because your Arcanite Illuvials might need some augments and some damage buffs to scale throughout the game. So this is going to be a very helpful example of how you can just put 2 more Illuvials that now add a whole lot of more depth and options of choice to your team. But we still essentially work with the same core of this 8 Illuvia setup, and you're just thinking, okay, what can I maybe deviate to in the future? The same options you have with, for example, adding a different carry option. Now, looking at this team, what are we lacking? Well, we would be lacking any kind of rogue or access to our opponent's backline. Our opponent's playing some Invoker, Psion-based team. It's likely they're gonna beat us. So how can we, for example, counter that? Well, one of the easy, very strong rogue combinations would be a Ramfire. And it's not really difficult to put that into your team, right? Because you just go Ramfire, you add in 1 or 2 weapons and 1 or 2 augments. But now we're already getting into a range of, well, don't really have that much a slot for more things, right? Because if we're looking at this now, without having put any augments so far into the team, we had 16 out of 28, so there would be space for 12 augments. But currently, we would have 3 carry Illuvials in our team that all probably want 2 specific carry augments. In Ramfire's case, probably still like double energy gain, so you can utilize Inferno, for example. But yeah, let's just check that out for a second. So we would want, if we go for the Ramfire tag, Ramfire is one of the more expensive tags in that sense, because it requires you to run 2 additional weapons, and it requires you to run Ramfire and 2 additional carry augments for our Ramfire. So we would run these 2, and then we would put 4 more augments for Scoriox and Phosphorus, just for the sake of choosing some. There's not going to be optimal in every single scenario, right? Just for like showcasing a little bit. We can go for example, the damage reduction / cleanse immune on our Phosphorus, plus a scaling damage augment, which is usually pretty good on Phosphorus. And then we can combine that with, I don't know, Scoriox is usually doing well. We can just give it some attack speed and Fusion Igniter. Now, Fusion Igniter got nerfed a lot, just for the sake of showcasing something that would be working very well, would be working totally fine, essentially. So now, we can check at this, and we have the augments for our carries. We have multiple different carry options. We have multiple different options of playing the early game, and we are at 22 out of 28. So at that point, we still need to add late game augments, and at that point, we would also probably be looking at, well, these look like somewhat low quality Illuvials. So at this point, you can kind of decide for yourself, would you want to add higher quality versions of these Illuvials, or would you want to add more augments? Those are more or less the options that you're faced with at that point, and this is also going to be pretty much very meta dependent. Some of the, especially if you're sticking on the low quality Illuvials, you would probably usually want to default to indomitable augments, as if your Illuvials are just very low quality, small tank guys, then, well, they die pretty quickly, and adding more defensive stats and health and so on is not that valuable. So if you're sticking with the low quality Illuvials, Indomitable and Invulnerable, very strong late game choices. If you're upgrading to higher quality Illuvials in like a team that genuinely runs higher quality Illuvials like Colossus and similar, going for health regen or healing or max health or resistance increase augments is gonna be very valuable. In a sense, oftentimes running Arcanite or similar, just running like one of these, very good. You can even reduce one of the augments on the bird. You could, for example, just not run this and just run a 40% Omnivamp on your bird as a default, and switch the Omnivamp to nearest to allies when you get a legendary augment that you would be putting on Phosphorus, because Phosphorus uses everything from tank to damage very well anyways. So you could be playing towards that in mind, with essentially, well, I'm probably going to get some legendary augments every now and then, so I don't have to overload my team on augments that I then can't use anymore if I get the legendary augments. But yeah, looking at this, we essentially covered the front line, we covered the tank augments, and we covered also some utility for our carries. It's at 27 now. So there's not that much room for tech choices at this point, and that is the very big downside of running this essentially more flexible setup with multiple Illuvials and multiple carry options, because you can't run all the tech augments in the world that you want to run. For example, it is very hard to fit in a triple exalted biogenic suppressor for the triple anti-heal or the triple less energy gain options. It is very hard to, for example, fit in a true sight augment, even though now in this case, well, we have one more slot. We could fit in a true sight augment to counter people playing Spore, playing Air, playing Empath builds, playing Crunk with Blind, and so on and so on. Or you can just run another just overall universal augment like this one, where both the team health or the 800 max health on a single Illuvial are very good. In general, what you would currently be lacking to some extent would be a doubles augment setup on Cinch. You could consider to just play 40% Omnivamp and the scaling or Mega Power on your Phosphorus as a default, and then just put on 2 tank augments on your Cinch, as that is your main carry. You could, for example, go for this one as health regen, or the 800 heal can, depending on how the matchup and opponent go, very, very strong, and adding either 800 health or 80-80 resistance as the other options, as depending on what your opponent is doing, both can be very, very good. And now you have a very, very strong main tank in your Cinch in the late game composition. You can have, once your main tank is falling and the smaller tanks are focused, they have all some Indominatables on them, or maybe you can even go for Indomitable on things like Lulura and Ripterus, which is usually very, very strong, maybe even on your Ramfire. So this is what we, for example, have ended on, starting at the very, very lean idea of 8 Illuvials plus 2 weapons plus 1 ranger suit, which then you can combine with 17 augments. You can play all the tech decision augments in the world you want. You can play all the Cypher Matrix, biogenic suppressors, and so on that are very, very good at countering specific niche enemy compositions. But then you're forced into the same Illuvials, and if your opponent has like maybe better Illuvial setups or maybe good augment setups to countering you, you can be very open to losing to those strategies. Then the next option was that we upgrade the quality of our 8 standard Illuvials throughout the game. So for example, instead of a lesser Water Grokko, we can have an Exalted Water Grokko, or we can play Stoic Hydro Lynxes to upgrade our Water Bulwark Illuvials. Then the third option on how you can approach team building is if you start adding in a composite synergy that maybe is really, really easy to fit into your team. In this example, that would be substituting our Kling and maybe our Lolura for a Caradulu and a Ripterus, as Caradulu still fills out the Bulwark slot of Kling. And then we could say, well, we don't value Bloom and Lolura very highly in this matchup, and in this matchup Ripterus and Toxic is going to be tremendously more valuable. So now your team is not as one-sided anymore, and you can threaten that, well, maybe I go for the Rogue, maybe I go for the Toxic, maybe I go for, well, big new thing, maybe I go for the big Ramfire. Ramfire being the more costly option though, compared to adding in Caradulu and Ripterus. That's 2 Illuvial slots and you don't need extra augments for them. Very, very easy to flex that in to your 8 Illuvial teams. And the more expensive, more difficult one is the Ramfire carry option in this case, where we would be requiring to run 2 additional weapons and 2 additional augments. So this would be a 5 team slot commitment to run the Ramfire option. That's why it is very costly. We haven't really seen it a whole lot recently. Maybe we're going to see it a lot more. A new patch literally just dropped, so maybe Ramfire is gonna start slaying the Invoker backlines again, and we will see this combination more often. Maybe it will start slaying the Empaths again and again. Ramfire, just as an example for this, is a rogue tech option, like another carry, another set of weapons, and another 2 set of augments. 5 slots in your team essentially means you lose the chance to run a bunch of tech options in your augments at that point, and you're running a very lean non-tech option in the augments, but many tech options in your Illuvials team, where you can go for Toxic, a different composite, or you can go for a different carry Illuvial, shifting in this example from range DPS, melee DPS, or rogue, I guess high burst damage plus DPS from Inferno. And then looking at how you go for the augments in such a setup, where if we are, so to say, sticking on the low quality tank Illuvials, going Indomitable and Invulnerable is very high value. If you're going for higher quality tanks, then these augments are not as valuable. Indomitable, at least probably at 1 or 2, still one of the best late game augments in the game though. So don't forget that. Very, very strong augment overall. And if you're playing for a very, very strong tank, in our example, this would be Singe as our main tank Illuvial, high health, high resistances. You can go for something like health regen and healing, or resistances and max health to begin with. And this is kind of how I'm approaching team building at the moment. I'm thinking, okay, I can play 8 Illuvials team, and then I can play all the augments that I need. Do I need augments right now? Do I need all these niche counter augments to beat my enemy teams? If the answer is yes, perfect, I go for the 8 Illuvial team. If the answer is, okay, I need a lot of niche augments, but I don't need all of them, then I can put in some higher quality versions of my lean Illuvials. So for example here, more expensive water bulwark tanks, for example, more expensive water bulwarks. And then if I say, well, I actually don't really need any niche Illuvial augment counter options in the game right now, I rather need a different win condition, because the win conditions I have at the moment, they're not cutting it. There's some stuff that I can't beat. Then I can cut on those augments even further, and I can put in a win condition Illuvial like a Ramire, which is one of the more extreme examples of a niche counter Illuvial, versus my enemy is clumping everything in a corner, enemy is playing a full nature team, enemy is playing a very Psy and Invoker based team. Ramire, super sick attack option for that. And yeah, that is essentially the big difference between using augments as a niche counter and using Illuvials for more flexibility, and Illuvials as a counter as well, because that is what Ramire is, right? And looking at, for example, the Cypher Matrix nerfs, looking at a lot of nerfed augments, Ramire looks pretty good right now. I wouldn't be, maybe it doesn't see play, and maybe it doesn't see play because everybody is going to be like, well, if I play something weak to it, my opponents will all start playing Ramire. So it's kind of this like mind game that it exists, and therefore it's kind of determining what's happening. Maybe we just see a lot of it. I'm not certain of that yet, but I hope this was a really good walkthrough and example on how to approach team building and the different options that you have. I hope everybody enjoyed watching this, and there's one last option, but I think I covered that more or less in the Caradulo video, very in depth, where you start out with some strong early game thing and then you just entirely switch it out to something else. So I'm not gonna repeat that a whole lot here. I just want to have this as a very basic guide on how to get into, where you don't have to think about all the super in-depth options that you do have when you start to be selling and switching Illuvials, and you start to incorporating a switching of strategies throughout the game. I would say that's a topic for another video. If you guys want to hear that, let me know in the comments, and see you guys in the next one.